Good afternoon, and welcome to our emergency board meeting. It is 12:48 p.m. on this lovely Tuesday of June 16th, I believe it is. And we're meeting today because we had a little bit of a conflict with our bylaws, in that we were trying to make it as safe as possible for volunteers on election day and shorten up the time that people would go to the polls and vote. But most towns did do that too. A lot of them shorten the time, but our bylaws is very specific. And because of that, we had to meet today to change the time of when the polls will be open for voting for the public. So I'll have a select board clerk read you Article 2, Section 2.
Okay, so this is from our Town of Holliston General Bylaws dated May 2019 as the most current edition. Article 2, covering town elections. Section 2 of Article 2, covering date and time. The election shall be held pursuant to a warrant on the Tuesday following the third Friday in May, at which time the polls shall open at 7 a.m. and remain open continuously until 8 p.m. Do you want to go over that?
And our emergency powers allowed us to change the date of the election, but not the time when the polls are open, according to our bylaws. So that is what we need a motion for.
Could we ask our town council to weigh in on this, Mr. Roney? And
Sure.
Just give us,
Kate?
at least she's reviewed this.
Kate, you've reviewed this?
Yeah, sure. So Holliston is a bit different than other towns, and it was recommended on the Clerks Association to shorten the time frame, because what the general laws specify is there has to be at least a 4-hour window to permit voting, and the latest time you can open the polls is noon time. So we were quite consistent with the general laws when it was posted, and it was recommended by the Clerks Association to shorten it up to protect the poll workers, so the exposure time and duration that they're just going to be interacting with people is reduced. The trick is with Holliston, unlike many other towns, it specifies the time for the polls to be open. And what the emergency legislation did was it says, it uses the keywords notwithstanding, and it cites the appropriate general laws, and it says any local bylaw to the contrary you can postpone, because, right, it's pretty common that towns specify when their election date is. It's like whatever Monday in the third Monday or the fourth Monday, whatever is specified in their bylaw. That's quite common. So when they passed the emergency legislation, they contemplated that they would have to violate many towns' bylaws when allowing for the postponement. But the legislation is silent as to hours of allowing the polls to be open. So in that way, we're constrained with the bylaws. So in order to avoid the bylaw, you would have had to sought judicial intervention through some type of court action, injunctive relief, to alter that time. Right. And now we're stuck with where we are. The election is in a week's time, and the decision for the board is whether or not we just comply with the bylaw and repost that election warrant to be consistent with the bylaw.
The chief has a question for you.
Council, Chief Cassidy, the Emergency Management Director. I'm also looking at the Emergency Act that was approved by the General Court. Section 1B says the Select Board, Town Council, or City Council of a city or town postponing a municipal caucus or municipal election pursuant to this act, following consultation with the local election official and the chief operating officer of the municipality as to logistics and feasibility, vote to reschedule the municipal caucus or municipal election. So wouldn't subsection B allow the board to, with regards to logistics and feasibility, to address the time issue, which is different from our bylaws?
I mean, that's a broad interpretation of it, and I think the argument we'd make. So let's play this out. If there were a challenge to the election, that would be the argument we would make, right? That we were well within the special legislation to modify the hours, and the goal is obviously the health of our election workers. And whether or not a court would broadly interpret that authority is, a question. It's not clear cut. Whereas the other authority that it vests the Board of Selectmen with is very clear, and we can confidently say that's appropriate under the legislation. Whereas here, it's a questionable call. It's certainly an argument that we could make in defense of an election.
Because I understand the section 1, subsection A, where it talks about notwithstanding any general or special law or bylaw to the contrary, but what the clerk just read is our bylaws specify a specific date in May. So that's already a bylaw notwithstanding. So I'm thinking that the fact that we're under a local state of emergency, the fact that the general court allowed these provisions, with you, I think that the decision to go 12-4 on the polling date is defensible. And certainly, my argument also would be that it's within the intent and the language of the legislation that was approved.
It's certainly a legal argument that could be made. It's just one that we can't say with certainty that would withstand judicial scrutiny.
Certainly.
So, there's always a risk to anything, and whether or not the court would look to the circumstances, state of emergency, pandemic, highly contagious disease, the polls being open longer exposes the workers to a greater extent than need be, because we publicized it in a really thoughtful way to notify people that there were changes common across the state, that the hours were reduced, locations moved to adjust for these unusual circumstances. Yes, those are all things that weigh in our favor.
Okay, great, thank you.
John, you had a question?
I do. Kate, is the action to expand the hours pursuant to our bylaw, as just piggybacking on what you just had with Mike Cassidy, is this really just out of abundance of caution now? We're resolving an issue with this potential vote today to change the hours to reflect the bylaw, because we can, correct?
Yeah, it's certainly permissible to expand the hours beyond the 4 that were set in the original warrant. And it's a belt and suspenders approach, because I don't want to say hamstrung, because there are those legal arguments that are perfectly logical defenses to any potential complaint.
So,
but
so my follow-up
it's
to
a
that...
minimization of
Sorry,
risk.
I apologize. Kate, you there?
No.
So
Yeah, I'm here.
My follow-up to that is Article 2, number 4. We are within the 7-day period today of the general election. But are you suggesting that if we take action today, we are compliant with that section?
Yeah, because it's a 7-day posting requirement. It's determined in days. So we believe that if you took a vote, reposted immediately today, you'd be compliant with that 7-day limitation.
So the chief's position is one that could be defended, but this action, if we take it today, is a remedy. It just requires more poll workers, exposures, risk, things of that nature, but we're adhering then to the letter of our bylaw. Short notice, but it's, the circumstances, I think, are dictating the best intentions of, as you said, scheduling a town election during a pandemic with minimal hours was the right thing to think about.
Right.
Unfortunately, this oversight requires us to take an action, which I think just remedies an issue, but it doesn't present any further risk to us, legally or otherwise.
Right.
Yeah,
And had we known, we could have gotten a ruling on this a couple weeks ago or whatever.
Sure. I think Tina had a question.
Gina?
If we were to, so earlier I think we were talking about the ability to appeal to the court to get some sort of variance here so that we don't have to, we can amend our bylaw and remain at 12 to 4 p.m. If we, well, first of all, is that even conceivable that we could get that within 7 days?
So we have gotten court relief for other towns for different election concessions. And in those circumstances, the turnaround time was a few days.
Okay.
So conceivably, it's possible.
Okay.
But it all depends upon the court docket, and whether or not they take it up quickly. But there's e-filing and, so Holliston is Middlesex County, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so the Middlesex Superior is taking e-filings, and then we would call the clerk's office to say this is something that's urgent and needs to be taken up right away. It is theoretically feasible, but it's, of course, a short window.
Okay, a couple follow-up questions then. If we were not to win in court and get the shortened hours, how does that position us then if we were to be challenged with keeping it 12 to 4 and then challenged after the election by some other party? Does that weaken our defense? So if we have all the strength of Chief Cassidy's comments as our defense, would that then weaken it?
Well, I don't think it weakens it because I think the arguments are different, right? Here you're looking for relief into the future if you're going into court today. To file an action, you're looking for relief ahead of time, and you're saying, listen, the purpose of this is to protect our pool workers, and we're constrained only by this bylaw. We already have legislative relief on most aspects that we're certain of. And I think in the defense position, we raised the issues of, well, we were still compliant because the language of the legislation was a little bit more flexible when it talked about logistics. So I think the arguments are different, so I don't think one puts you in a worse position by doing it.
Okay, then I just have two questions for Liz then, our town clerk. There are no ballot questions on this warrant.
No.
Okay, and we have two contested races
Yes.
for planning board and for school committee?
Correct.
Okay. And the concern here has been and remains the number of poll workers available to...
Yes, we've had a hard time staffing, and we did get a waiver for reduced staffing. We're still having a hard time. As you know, most of our poll workers are in the high-risk category.
Okay.
So, ideally, the 4 hours would be great, but I don't know conceivably, Kate, if that could even happen. Getting the court order.
Jeff had a question?
What did she say?
John, I mean-
Did she ask me, Liz, did you ask me a question? I'm
I
sorry.
would just, conceivably, could we do it, get the court order? And I don't,
It's conceivable. It's conceivable, but there are no guarantees.
And there's a cost.
and there's a cost, correct?
There is a cost because in Holliston, our arrangement is everything's flat fee with the exception of litigation, and this would be considered litigation. So there's a cost, you know, a few hours because you have to prepare the complaint, and then theoretically have a hearing In my circumstance, when I had my recent complaint, they waived the hearing because the elections division did not object. Excuse me. But in another circumstance with another town, my colleague Brian had to have a full-on hearing in front of a judge remotely. So you're looking at maybe 3 hours, 4 hours, something like that.
Okay, and then on the other side, you're looking at paying poll workers 10 more hours to be there. So that's also.
John?
So my question's a little bit directed towards Chief Cassidy, and it's this. We made a decision to move the town election from May to June for public health reasons. We're hearing from the town clerk that the reasons are still real. The poll workers, traditionally over 60, are in a risk class. She's having difficulty fulfilling even the 4-hour window. If we were to extend and abide by our town bylaw, the polling hours to 13 hours of coverage, you're tripling, theoretically, the exposure time of this class to a virus that is still very much among us.
Unless
right?
you have shifts.
Understood. The question I have is, if we were to look at tripling the amount of poll time for exposure, given the fact that this is next Tuesday, from a public health perspective, would you recommend us maintain this date under these circumstances, or possibly evaluate extending the town election out until we see more favorable COVID progress or case information?
I would not see a benefit to pushing the date out. We are at the point where we have community level spread, and that is not going to stop until there's a vaccine available.
Mm-hmm.
So whether this were to take place in June or July or August, the risk for the high-risk category poll workers would remain. And not only, as the clerk pointed out, is there the cost of the election workers themselves. I'm concerned as a town official about our liability of possibly exposing people and how much culpability we have if someone gets sick after having worked at our polls.
Kate might be able to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, so postponing is an option. I can't speak to the health aspects of whether or not the exposure is less in August. I would defer to the chief on that. His explanation seems sensible to me not being in the health industry. But yeah, either way, you'll still need to get judicial relief. You would get judicial relief then, and you would have a bigger window to seek that relief, but we can try to get it done in this short window and maintain people's expectations, especially given that so many folks have decided that they're not going to go to the polls and they're going to avail themselves of the remote voting opportunities, namely absentee or early voting. So I think our chances, we have a sympathetic ear in the court right now, but I can't say for certain what our chances of success are.
Would an additional week of time be helpful, Kate? If we moved our election 1 week?
So the trick is, and I have to think about this, because if you look at the emergency legislation, it says that if the selectmen vote to postpone, there's a 20-day notice period, a minimum of 20 days. So I think if we decide to postpone, it's going to be postponed longer than a week. I'd have to do that analysis of what the delay would be. And then there's the regular posting of the warrant requirement, which is 7 days.
Yeah.
So, but if I remember correctly, it's 20 days, you post a copy of the act, a copy of the selectmen's vote, and that has to be done for a minimum of 20 days. So,
There's a benefit to doing that, because then we can litigate and have less exposure for our residents and still be within the confines of the law and the rules. And if we got turned down, we'd still have time to adjust and announce the opening and closing of the polls according to our bylaws. So that would give us all the time that we need to be able to have both options on the table, wouldn't you say? Do you concur with that, Kate?
yeah, and so I'm trying to look at the calendar. So 20 days brings us to, I think, the 6th, but we would do it on the 7th because I would want a buffer day, because you usually don't count the day of.
Yeah.
So I would want it a minimum of the 7th of July for the
Okay.
election. And now with the emergency legislation, we can do it anytime up to August 1st.
Because I concur with the chief's comments. His remarks are equally as important as our bylaws, I think. So, if we postpone till the 7th, we'll be able to try to get the litigation done so that we can keep the 4 hours of polling open that you wanted and your volunteers wanted. And we'll have enough time, we'll know if we get refused, that then we can announce that we're going to be open according to the bylaws. So it gives us the flexibility that John was trying to capture. It answers the chief's concerns, it answers the volunteers' concerns. It seems to me it covers all the bases if we do extend.
You're talking July 4th week, so the volunteers I have now may not be available then.
Right,
So getting into July is a concern with vacations.
I know, but
If we're going to.
But if we're gonna put risk of health first, I think we have to consider this. Tina?
So I think we should explore what that means for boards and committees that are affected by a vote delay, an election delay. It may be nothing, but I'd like to hear about that. I think we have to understand the cost, if there's a cost associated with changing the date. And then I'd also like to explore a little bit the risk of moving forward with the plan as it was, 2 hours ago. So I understand that there is a risk, but I'd like to understand what that risk is. Where there are no ballot questions, we have 2 contested races. So can you just describe the risk?
I'll make one more comment.
Yeah,
before you do.
so
Oh, hang on one second. Liz has a
Just
comment.
80% of the average number of voters in town elections have already asked for ballots. So our average number of voters in the town election is 1,450 and change.
Yeah. So you're seeing.
We're at 80% of that number right now.
So that takes away some risk.
Which also helps with our argument when we're seeking injunctive relief,
Right.
that we're not,
We're not
we're not eliminating the opportunity of our constituents to vote.
If we're
Right.
seeing 80% of what we typically see in terms of numbers voting during an election, we're seeing 80% have requested a mail-in ballot?
Correct.
For a
Okay.
date that was advertised next week.
John?
Well, I was thinking, again, just spitballing, Mark,
Right.
the risk of expanding the hours next week is on, as I see, to answer Tina's question, is public health. It's a risk of exposure to a greater number of residents. And Liz is having difficulty getting people to fill those roles already. So we have that issue. But from the sacred perspective of maintaining an open election, I would think adding more hours is a better path and a better outcome than it would be if we were going the other direction of pulling it down to 4 hours. People should be welcoming the opportunity, if we pull it off, to add more hours to the voting day. To me, it just boils down to what area of risk do you want to land this decision on? Mike is suggesting, 30 days, 20 days from now isn't, from a public health perspective, not much better, but it might give us the breathing room to seek injunctive relief. I'm a little concerned about the cost, because I get that if we go with a 3-shift poll worker cost, it's this, but the legal costs are this. Is that a wash? Are we going to spend more in legal costs because we wanted to stick with the 4 hours? I'd like to understand that.
You're talking $1,500–1,600 more in payroll
To cover the additional,
hours.
9 hours. Okay, and Kate was saying a few hours of legal work.
How
Kate,
much would that be, Kate?
So someone else has to do the math for me, but I think your hourly is 180, so say 4 hours times 180, what does that equel?
800.
It's under $800.
800, we would say 800 to 1,000, depending upon.
$720.
It's less than what we would pay. And if I may, then the question is, do we move forward with next week's date and go for litigation?
Well, the issue is that if we lose, we don't want to set the town up for getting sued.
If we lose, what happens, Kate? We don't.
So let's say if we lose and we lose before the election day, I guess we can always postpone at that point and reassess,
But then
so
we're
that's
even
an option
further out.
too.
Yeah,
But you'll be pushed further
we'll
out.
be further out.
And so to Tina's point earlier, what's the result if, for the boards and commissions, if you postpone? And the answer is they stay as holdovers. So even though their natural term would have expired, they would remain as holdovers.
Okay. Any other questions, Tina?
No, I don't have any questions. It's very clear to me that public health is the #1 priority, and we need to make the right decision for public health. I think that's consistent with how we're approaching town meeting. I also think that the practicality of it matters quite significantly. I think the comments, although they don't rise to the public health concern, the comments about being able to pull people in July to work the polls is a significant one.
Well,
The logistics of it are...
pulling people in for 10 hours is a significant. She's going to have a horrible time with that, too. So either way, we've got issues that we need to resolve. John?
The only follow-up question I would have is for the chief. I mean, I asked the question initially about his perspective on the public health, if having an election next Tuesday versus sometime in July, are we making a better decision by deferring until July? Or is it the same public health outcome on that question?
Same public health outcome.
So there's no benefit to delaying it.
Not based on
because of the community spread and
the way the numbers are right now. If we were still on the trend line of cases increasing and still on the surge, I would say that waiting, but now that we're at plateau, I don't see any benefit from a public health standpoint.
Do you have the slots filled right now for the 4-hour plan for next week?
Yes, we do.
Any flexibility with the staffing? Did you have a couple of extra, or are you just meeting your levels, or?
We have a couple that we can call on. We usually have for emergency purposes, if somebody gets sick or can't come in. But it's like, how many people? 2 that you have on deck? Yeah.
So you've got, how many people covering a 4-hour shift?
Right now, with 20,
Yes, because
we have
one checker in, one checker out, one inspector, so that's 12. And then the EVAV team.
right. So that's how many more is that?
6, and then
us.
us.
So how many more workers would you need to cover 13 hours, in addition to what Bonnie and Diane just said?
It depends on who's willing to stay the full day and who's not, of who we have currently.
Conservatively.
We probably have to double it. And we have to get another police officer as well.
Right.
So another dozen or so people?
Yeah.
Okay.
And do we have to provide food if we're having them for a full day?
Yeah.
Kate, what's our chances of the town?
I'm sorry, one more quick
Go ahead.
question. Chief, to your knowledge, are other, or Liz, are other communities having municipal elections right now? Have they been doing them?
They've been doing them, and they've been,
Yes.
some are doing them with decreased hours, some are doing their full day.
Okay, so that underlines.
I'd say most of my towns are doing it with decreased hours, because the idea is if you have multiple shifts of multiple workers, it, in terms of spread, the sheer number of people who are exposed to other people is increased, right? So it's, I don't want to say exponential, but, and again, I defer to the chief on this piece, but it's just more people who could then pass to more people who meet up with different people and therefore expose them. So I'd say most of my towns have reduced hours, but they are taking place currently.
And one more point is that we can only have one voter list, which means it's shared by multiple people if you have multiple shifts.
Right. Kate,
Yeah.
what
We
if,
also have to have some
what's
masks.
the chances of the town getting sued because the bylaws weren't followed, and if we lost the litigation for,
That was my risk question, yeah.
what, you know, I mean, how much could the town be sued for? That's kind of important.
Well, it's not really an issue of monetary damages, unlike other litigation. It's a matter of would they certify the election results. So I think that would be the result, because it would be an issue more of injunctive relief. Just like when we're, like earlier when I said, let's try to quantify the damages. How would I argue it to the court? And I'm not talking about monetary damages. I'm talking about, okay, more risk factors. So for example, liken it to town meeting and the legislative relief or actually strike that, judicial relief that we sought prior to the legislation being enacted. We had some towns that wanted to reduce a quorum. So we went to court and we said, okay, court, judge, this is the situation. We're going to ask for a reduced quorum, but our town meeting is going to have only the really fundamental articles. So your omnibus budget, all those kind of financial articles, and everything else will defer until the fall town meeting. So minimized damages at the outset. And here we would argue the same thing. We're minimizing the damage because we publicized, we made all of those early voting and absentee ballot options available. The purpose being to protect the health workers. We have very few contested seats up for election and no ballot questions. So those things collectively support the position that we don't need those extended hours. And we can reduce and accomplish what we need to within the 4-hour window. So if we were to be challenged after the fact, it would be those kinds of things that would be discussed, and I assume the challenger, whomever that may be, would raise different issues. Well, my expectations were X, Y, and Z, despite the publication, so.
And that they didn't get their constitutional right to vote when it was convenient for them.
That's exactly right, which is a fundamental right, and, not to be minimized.
Right, that could usurp all of our arguments, that constitutional right. John?
Quick question for the chief. Do you happen to know if, with respect to recruiting poll workers or individuals that could work that day for us, we have town employees right now who are not here full-time because they're teleworking or rotating in and out. Are they an available pool of resources that we can direct to the high school next week if we were to pull this off?
If if it didn't put them over their hours, so they would need their department head to reassign them for other duties as assigned. And we would have to make sure that they themselves are not in a risk category where we are knowingly asking an employee to be in a risky work environment where they could be subjected to.
But conceivably, you could, to assist with Liz's, quest for numbers and people to work, you could conceivably think of a half a dozen or so people.
Oh, that number, yeah, I can't see the 20 to 40 that.
But if we're embarking on this process, these people they're already on the clock. We're
Correct.
paying them.
Yes.
And
You might be modifying their hours.
We're modifying it, but we're making use of that labor, so we don't have to worry about paying them. And it may be a more readily available pool with a simple phone call, so.
Is that legally possible?
Just asking the chief from his perspective, but Mr. Ritter's not here, so I've got to go somewhere.
So you're taking a water department employee and having them, instead of that, you're having them
Hypothetically,
there?
yes.
You could do that.
Other duties as assigned for those who are not subject to a collective bargaining agreement, who are subject to our town bylaws, yes.
And they'd be working
Yeah,
in
just be
a,
careful on the labor side, be careful on your labor side, because union employees, there's a different analysis there. So if you're talking non-union employees, that's maybe an okay discussion.
we're talking non-union.
Right.
Kate, what would you do if you were us? Just to be quite frank, I mean, we value your experience and all the rest, so.
Well, so it's not my money to spend, so it's hard for me, and I feel self-serving to say it, but I might say, let's try for the immediate litigation, and fingers crossed, hopefully we'll get it done. But I don't know if that comes across as self-serving, because then you haven't interfered with people's expectations. They at this point know the hours to be 12 to 4, and if they haven't voted early, nothing changes for them. And we're having this discussion in public setting, which is actually 100% appropriate. I'm not saying it shouldn't be in public session. So people are aware this is an issue. But if we can try to resolve it before the election within the confines of the law, it might be worth it. But I would feel horrible giving that advice, and then, as I said, I can't guarantee a result. If we were to lose, and then you feel like it was money that wasn't worth it. So it's hard for me to say.
And then we'd have to,
without
change the meeting date, correct, if we didn't win the litigation.
Election date.
The election date, I'm sorry.
We won't have time.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have time.
We wouldn't have the 7 days is the issue.
You need 20 days.
Yeah, you would have to reset that calendar, so you could postpone, I think, and I'm going to try to pull up
Postpone the
legislation.
election itself, 20 days, but that would be from 7 days from now or whatever.
Yeah.
If I can give should we share our opinion on what, are you there, or do you?
I am there, yeah.
Okay, well, what would your opinion be?
So, my opinion would be that we keep the course that we have, that we not change the date nor the time, that we seek court, what is the correct word, Kate? A court injuncture, allowing us...
Yeah, an injunction, yeah.
Injunction, okay. That we seek that. There's a little bit of fingers crossed that we get it, and our plan is then vetted through that process as okay. But that is my opinion, is that we keep what we have in place and that we seek a court injunction.
John?
I kind of disagree. I think what we should do is vote today to extend the voting hours. I think if we encounter any kind of resistance as a result of moving the date or seeking an injunction, we're moving into a space with electoral outcomes that any citizen who's voting could easily claim that they were grieved, and I don't want to encounter that. This process is too important. I think if we would accept all the risk, and it's Liz's polling workers' risk, and extend the hours next Tuesday, no voter can say that we impeded their ability to practice their First Amendment rights. We're done. Their work is done. And I think Liz has given us some numbers to indicate the risk of exposure is minimized because there's such a high rate of vote by mail. I'm hoping that, if we go down that road, Liz can conceive of a way to modify the polling environment with expected fewer people coming to expedite the voters in and out with fewer workers. But I think I'd rather move in that direction than in any way mess around with an election because of something that was our oversight. I think by giving the town more time to vote, the voters left harmless. And that's where it should stand. I think any other risk should be on us, and we should mitigate that.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
Respectfully, I would agree with Ms. Hine, and I believe based on the way the act was written, as counsel has indicated, it's an argument that could be made. I could see us getting the injunctive relief.
So
What do you think?
those are the two options we have. Well, the issue is if we don't get the injunction,
We got to move the election.
we've lost the 7 days,
Yep.
and now we're in much bigger trouble.
And you'll more than likely, if I'm not mistaken, if we lose the injunction, you're going to likely have to go to a 13-hour poll day in July.
Yeah,
I mean, we'd have reason to think that if we lost the injunction, it was for a reason.
right.
But in other words, we wouldn't have solved the problem. We just kicked the can and pissed off a shitload of voters.
Right, exactly.
Okay, is that a fair characterization, though, that number one, if we lose the injunction, we have to move the date to July? Because when we were talking about it before, you were saying it doesn't set us up for necessarily a challenge to keeping it at 12 to 4. I mean, and the other piece, let me preface that by saying, is this in your mind a question of losing the injunction or just running out of time to get it?
Yeah, there's of course a risk that you don't prevail in the argument. That's the first, and I can't say how the court would decide. They've been friendly to these kinds of complaints. The second risk is the courts are working remotely too, so can they get it together for the 23rd? That's a very big risk, although I will say that mine in Plymouth County was turned around in 3 days, and Brian's was, hold on, I'm going to shout to him and ask him, hold on.
I am extremely sensitive.
Okay, and Brian's town meeting quorum argument in Essex County was 3 to 4 days. I think he's coming into my office right now.
Essex is a smaller county.
Oh, okay, and we had another one. Is that Middlesex County? Oh, and he had a second one in Essex, which actually, it was pushed a week apart. So his hearing was scheduled a week later. So that's the real risk. And we can't say, Middlesex County, we can't say because we haven't had litigation there yet. Right, Brian?
I think we have
Oh,
to extend
Adam in
the
my
hours
office had one and it was more like a 4-day
in order to
turnaround.
in
So
order to be safe all the way around.
that's one of the bigger risks that they just don't get to us in time.
Yeah,
we can try to
then we have-
alert them to the fact that, listen, this is a real emergency,
Yeah.
and work with the election division to notify them to determine whether or not they'll have an objection or not, and go from there. But that's the bigger part of the risk, I think.
All right.
You want to say something about sensitivity?
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely sensitive to your concerns about
Oh.
people not
Yeah.
being able to vote. My undergraduate degree's in government. This is what I've trained for. But at the same time, I think we've given the public the opportunity to avail themselves of the right to vote. They don't physically have to go to the polling location on the day stated. They have the ability to vote ahead of time.
But
There's
they,
nothing magical about physically going to the polling location and filling it
but
out.
their
Apparently you have not been on Facebook lately.
their constitutional rights are to be able to go to the polling.
That's not really what it says. It says you have the right to cast your ballot. It doesn't specify you have to go to the polling location.
And we've been effective in our efforts
But that's-
to.
The fact that they're talking about it online means that they're aware of the options for how they can do it.
Historically, though, we've always,
I understand historically, but we're in very different times.
I think I'm under the impression that we have to expand the hours to be safe, that that's our safest course of action, and we have to find the personnel and volunteers to do that.
What's the you can sign me up,
I was
Liz.
gonna say, who here wants to
Here
help?
wants to volunteer.
I will volunteer,
Okay.
and
We'll need you.
you can put me through the training.
So I will take a motion.
Okay. Motion to extend, or a motion to declare the June 23rd, 2020 municipal election poll time from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. to 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Is there anything else you need from us, Liz, to
Just,
make it official in any way?
no,
Okay.
we'll just take names and phone numbers for the polls.
Kate, is there anything else?
I think you've got to now pivot towards a very aggressive public awareness notice, starting with the message board out front, which does say 12 to 4, by
Yes,
the way.
which we will do, but could we maybe get somebody to write up a press release? Maybe Kate, is that something you could do? You know, given the circumstances and that we've been enlightened to the fact that there was an oversight on the special legislation, and we are now upholding our bylaws as 7
Yes.
a.m. to 8 p.m. Something to that effect?
I don't know if Kate
Are
heard.
you asking me?
Yeah.
I'm happy to do it,
Okay.
unless you guys want to.
No, I think if you would do it, that'd be great. And is there anything else, Kate, we should do as a motion today? Or does that cover it?
No, I don't think there's anything that needs to be official action, but just while you have the opportunity, encourage people to be mindful of these poll workers who are dedicating their time and putting themselves at risk for the process, and vote by mail,
Right.
you know, and be mindful of the people around you, social distance, wear
We
your
will-
face mask.
We will ask Holliston Reporter to put that out for the public. I'm sure they will.
Do we plan on screening the poll workers that day to make sure they're asymptomatic?
We hadn't planned on screening them.
No, we're just leaving it up to them to know whether they
I
have
would
any
do some
symptoms.
kind of screening, even if it's verbal when they arrive. Or you.
Oh, sure.
Public-
We have that.
Yeah,
We have
we
that.
can go do the checklist with them.
Okay.
Mark, before we end the meeting, if we were heading in that direction, I just wanted to come back and talk about the quorum for town meeting and ask that that be something in an update coming up. Given what we're going through here with bylaw, attention to the bylaw and the steps that we would need to take were we to change our quorum. I think that's a conversation we haven't had in much detail.
We probably should have that at a regular meeting.
Absolutely, I would.
Because this is an emergency meeting, and I don't
Absolutely, no,
think...
I was
And we are
asking.
required to provide notice of the intent to consider that not less than 7 days before the board's vote. So before you put it on an agenda, you need to make sure that that's far enough out in advance that we can let the public know that it's your intention to be discussing that specific item. So it can't just say town meeting, it needs to say town meeting quorum discussion.
So what I was going to ask is if you could update us on Monday on your thoughts on this, and then as a board on Monday, we could decide if we wanted to post so that we're 7
Okay.
days out from a
Sure.
possible decision.
Okay. And Donna was kind enough to print us out a warrant cleaned up, and you can get back to her with any comments you have. But we wanted to get this out to the Finance Committee soon, so get back to Donna with any comments. All right, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Yeah, you mind.
It is 1:39, and thank you folks for listening. Good night.
Let me
Good
get
good
your
day.
mind to sign.